My father opened his eyes after 20 years of silence between us and whispered the sentence that destroyed an entire marriage. "Why didn't you ever answer my letters?" For a second, I honestly thought I'd imagined it. The hospital room had been so quiet before that. Just the steady beeping of monitors and the low hum of air vents pushing cold air through Presbyterian Memorial's cardiac wing. Diane stood beside his bed holding a paper coffee cup. I was halfway to the door. And suddenly my 79-year-old father, the man who hadn't spoken to me in 2 decades, was staring directly at me like I was the one who disappeared. I remember gripping the door handle so hard my fingers cramped. What I whispered. His voice sounded weak and broken from the stroke. "The letters," he said again slowly. "I wrote you for years." Diane's face changed instantly. Not confusion. Fear. That was the moment I realized something terrible had happened long before that hospital room. But to explain how we got there, I have to go back to the Tuesday afternoon when the hospital first called me. I was working the late shift at St. Agnes High School's cafeteria outside Pittsburgh. Chicken patties. Instant mashed potatoes. Kids complaining about green beans nobody planned to eat anyway. Normal life. At 61 years old, my world had gotten small in the practical ways older working people's worlds sometimes do. Work. Bills. My apartment. Phone calls with my son Michael in Ohio every Sunday evening. Nothing dramatic. Nothing glamorous. That afternoon I was wiping down stainless steel counters when my cell phone rang from inside my apron pocket. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. "Claire Bennett," a woman asked after I answered. "Yes." "My name is Sandra. I'm a social worker at Presbyterian Memorial Hospital in Cleveland." The word Cleveland alone made my stomach tighten. That's where my father lived. Or at least where he'd lived the last I heard. "There's been a medical emergency involving your father, Harold Whitaker." I sat down immediately on an upside-down milk crate near the freezer. It's strange how the body reacts before the mind fully catches up. "What happened?" "He suffered a major stroke 3 days ago." I stared at the cafeteria floor tiles while students laughed somewhere down the hallway outside. 3 days ago. "Nobody called me for 3 days," Sandra continued gently. "His condition stabilized this morning, but the doctors believe family should come soon." Family. I almost laughed hearing that word. For 20 years I hadn't felt like anybody's family except my son's. "I don't think he wants me there," I said quietly. There was a pause. Then Sandra answered carefully, "Your father has asked for you several times while drifting in and out of consciousness." That unsettled me more than anything else. Because according to the story I'd lived with for 2 decades, Harold Whitaker stopped wanting me around long ago. After my mother died from ovarian cancer, everything changed quickly. Too quickly. Dad remarried Diane less than 2 years later. At first I tried. I really did. I came for holidays. Called weekly. Helped clean the house after his heart surgery. But little by little Diane turned every interaction into something uncomfortable. Too emotional. Too intrusive. Too expensive. Too needy. Eventually, every conversation with my father started sounding strangely rehearsed. Short. Careful. Distant. Then one day the calls simply stopped. At first I kept trying. Birthday cards. Voicemails. Christmas gifts. No answers. After a while, silence starts teaching you what words no longer will. So eventually I stopped trying too. That's how families disappear in America sometimes. Not through explosions. Through gradual emotional erosion. I drove to Cleveland the following morning in my old Toyota Corolla, with a travel mug of gas station coffee and a headache building behind my eyes the entire trip. Rain followed me most of the way up Interstate 76. Gray skies. Truck stops. November trees stripped nearly bare. By the time I reached the hospital parking garage, I already regretted coming. Not because I hated my father. Because I was afraid seeing him again would reopen grief I'd finally taught myself to survive. I'd come straight from work and barely changed clothes. Worn jeans. Old coat. Non-slip cafeteria shoes. Nothing about me looked impressive. Not that it mattered. Or at least I told myself it didn't. Presbyterian Memorial looked more like a luxury hotel than a hospital lobby. Quiet carpeting. Modern art on the walls. A piano near the entrance, no one was playing. I suddenly felt painfully aware of how tired and working class I looked. Then I saw Diane standing outside the cardiac unit speaking into her phone. Perfect hair. Camel-colored coat. Pearl earrings. 20 years older than when I last saw her, but still carrying herself with that polished suburban confidence I remembered so well. She spotted me immediately. For a second she looked genuinely shocked. Then guarded. Well, she said after ending her call I didn't think you'd actually come. I nodded once. How is he? Fragile. That word landed cold between us. Neither of us moved closer. Finally, Diane looked down briefly at my clothes. My shoes? The frayed cuff on my coat sleeve. And then she gave that little smile I remembered hating years ago. The tight one. The one designed to sound polite while wounding you anyway. You got nothing, she said softly. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just casually enough to sound cruelly honest. I stood there looking at her for several seconds. And strangely enough, I didn't feel angry. Just tired. Tired in the deep way older people get tired after carrying old pain too long. You don't have to worry, I said quietly. I'm not here for money. That's not what I meant. But it absolutely was. I almost turned around right then. Part of me wanted to protect whatever dignity I still had left. I should go, I muttered. Diane didn't stop me. That hurt more than the insult itself. I walked into the room anyway, mostly because some stubborn piece of my younger self still needed to see my father one more time before life closed the door permanently. Harold looked smaller than I remembered. Stroke patients often do. Machines surrounded him quietly. His gray hair had thinned. His hands looked fragile against the white blanket. For a long moment I simply stood there. This man had once carried me on his shoulders at county fairs. Taught me how to ride a bicycle. Cried harder than I did at my mother's funeral. And somehow we'd become strangers. I moved closer slowly. Hi, Dad, I whispered. Nothing. Just the monitor beeping steadily. I swallowed hard. Then turned toward the door. And that's when his eyes suddenly opened. Cloudy at first. Confused. Then focused directly on me. His lips parted weakly. Claire. I froze. Diane stepped forward immediately. Harold, don't try to talk. But he kept staring at me. Then came the question. The question that shattered 20 years of lies. Why didn't you ever answer my letters? For the first few seconds after my father asked about the letters, nobody in that hospital room breathed normally. Not me. Not Diane. Not even the nurse adjusting the IV pump near the wall. The heart monitor kept making its steady electronic rhythm while my entire understanding of the past 20 years started shifting underneath me. What letters, I asked quietly. My father looked confused. Deeply confused. Like a man suddenly realizing two versions of his life could not possibly both be true. The ones I wrote you, he whispered weakly. Birthdays, Christmases, after your mother's anniversary every year. His voice drifted off. I slowly turned toward Diane. And for the first time since arriving, I saw genuine panic in her eyes. Not irritation. Not superiority. Fear. Harold, she interrupted quickly, you're exhausted. The doctor said you shouldn't. Did you get them? He asked me again. I shook my head slowly. No. That single word changed the entire room. My father stared at me for a long moment. Then at Diane. Then back at me again. You never answered, he whispered. Dad, I never got anything. His face crumpled slightly. I think that was the moment the truth first reached him emotionally, even before his mind fully understood it. Diane stepped closer immediately. There must have been mail problems, she said too quickly, or maybe things got lost when Claire moved. I looked at her carefully. I lived in the same apartment for 16 years. Silence. Heavy silence. Then the nurse quietly excused herself from the room with the kind of professional instinct medical workers develop around family disasters. My father's breathing became uneven. You said she didn't want contact, he whispered toward Diane. Harold, please calm down. You told me she sent things back. Diane's face tightened. They were difficult years. That wasn't an answer. I pulled a chair closer to the bed slowly because my knees suddenly didn't feel reliable anymore. My father kept staring at me like he was searching for evidence of the daughter he thought abandoned him. And honestly, I was doing the same thing. Because suddenly the man I'd spent 20 years quietly resenting looked less like somebody who rejected me and more like somebody profoundly confused. The doctor eventually came in and forced everyone to settle down. Low stress, only he warned firmly after checking my father's blood pressure. Diane immediately took control of the conversation again after that. She should go home, she told the doctor, gently nodding toward me. This is all too emotional for Harold right now. But before I could answer, my father reached weakly toward my wrist. No. The word barely came out louder than air. Still, it stopped all of us. I want her here. Diane looked stunned. Not because he chose me. Because he contradicted her publicly. That told me more about their marriage than anything else could have. I stayed another hour after that. Mostly quiet. Mostly watching my father drift in and out of sleep while confusion clouded his expression every time he looked toward Diane. Finally, I stood to leave. I'll come back tomorrow, I told him softly. His fingers tightened weakly around my hand. Don't disappear again. Those words nearly broke me. Because from his perspective, I had disappeared. And from mine he had. Two people grieving the exact same abandonment for 20 years. That kind of damage changes families permanently. Outside the room, Diane followed me into the hallway almost immediately. The second the door closed behind us, her entire expression hardened. You shouldn't have said those things. I stared at her in disbelief. What things? That you never received letters? Because I didn't. Her jaw tightened slightly. Harold's memory has been inconsistent. Not inconsistent enough to remember writing me every Christmas. That landed. I could see it. For the first time in 20 years, Diane suddenly looked uncertain of her control over the story. You don't understand what those years were like, she said quietly. I folded my arms. No, I answered. Apparently I don't. She looked exhausted suddenly. Older. Less polished. He was devastated after your mother died. So was I. You left. I got married and moved 2 hours away, Diane. I didn't vanish. She looked down the hallway toward the room nervously. There were misunderstandings. No, I said quietly. There were lies. Her face changed again after that. Not rage. Something closer to shame. But before she could respond, the elevator doors opened and a doctor walked past us. The moment broke. I drove back to Pittsburgh that evening through freezing rain, barely able to focus on the road. Every memory from the last 20 years suddenly felt unstable. The unanswered birthday cards. The silent holidays. The years I convinced myself my father simply stopped loving me. Had he really been writing all along? By the time I reached my apartment after midnight, I was emotionally exhausted but too unsettled to sleep. So instead I opened the hallway closet. Buried behind winter blankets and old tax boxes sat a plastic storage container I hadn't touched in years. My mother's things. I carried it slowly into the living room floor and began sorting through papers while late-night news murmured from the television in the background. Old recipes. Church bulletins. Photographs curled at the corners. Then I found the first clue. An envelope addressed to me in my father's handwriting. Never mailed. My hand started shaking immediately. Inside was a birthday card dated 12 years earlier. Claire Bear. I know you probably don't want to hear from me anymore, but I still think about you every day. Diane says you asked for space, and I'm trying to respect that. I just hope you're all right. Love, Dad. I stared at the card for nearly 5 full minutes. Claire Bear. He hadn't called me that since I was a little girl. I found another card beneath it. Then another. Some sealed. Some opened. All written over different years. Every single one carrying the exact same heartbreak, a father trying to reach a daughter he believed no longer wanted him. And underneath all of it sat something even more devastating. A small stack of returned envelopes. My envelopes. Birthday cards I'd mailed him years ago. Unopened. Stamped return to sender. I sat alone on my apartment floor until almost dawn, surrounded by 20 years of proof that neither of us had truly walked away. Someone had been standing between us the entire time. I called off work the next morning for the first time in almost 8 months. Not because I was sick. Because my entire past suddenly felt unstable. I sat at my kitchen table drinking cold coffee while the stack of letters remained spread out in front of me like evidence from a criminal investigation nobody bothered solving until it was too late. My father's handwriting changed over the years. That part hurt unexpectedly. The early letters looked steady and confident. The later ones trembled slightly. You could actually see aging happening across the envelopes. One card still had a pressed maple leaf taped inside from a fall festival near Cleveland. Another contained a newspaper clipping about my son Michael graduating from community college, meaning my father had somehow followed our lives from a distance all those years. That realization broke something open inside me. I kept thinking about holidays. All those Christmas mornings I spent telling myself if Dad cared, he would have called. And meanwhile, somewhere in Ohio, my father was probably sitting in another room believing if Claire cared, she would have answered. Two lonely people grieving each other while somebody quietly maintained the wall between them. By noon, I was back on Interstate 76, driving toward Cleveland again. This time I carried the letters with me in a grocery bag beside the passenger seat. The sky looked colorless. Bare trees. Dirty snow piled near exit ramps. Typical northern Ohio winter beginning to settle in. When I arrived at the hospital, Diane was asleep in a chair beside my father's bed. For the first time since seeing her again, she looked less intimidating and more simply tired. Older women who spend years caregiving often end up carrying exhaustion deep into their bones. I understood that better than I wanted to. Still, the moment she saw the grocery bag in my hand, her expression changed immediately. Alert. Guarded. What's that? I placed the letters quietly on the tray table near my father's bed. Proof. My father slowly turned his head toward the stack. It took him several seconds to focus properly. Stroke patients often moved like that after heavy medication. Then he saw the handwriting. His own. Oh my God, he whispered. Diane stood up immediately. Harold shouldn't be overwhelmed right now. But he ignored her completely. His hands shook badly as he picked up one of the envelopes. I wrote this in 2011, he murmured. I know. You really never got them? No. The room felt colder suddenly. Not physically. Emotionally. My father looked toward Diane slowly. And for the first time in my entire life, I watched Harold Whitaker look genuinely afraid of his own wife. Diane! She folded her arms tightly. It wasn't that simple. That answer told us everything. My father's face drained of color. You told me she mailed my birthday cards back unopened. Diane's voice sharpened defensively. Because every time you heard from her, you spiraled emotionally for days afterward. That's not an answer. You had heart surgery, Harold, your blood pressure. You lied to me. Silence. Heavy silence. I stood near the window watching snow begin drifting outside over the hospital parking garage. And suddenly I realized something strange. I wasn't angry anymore. Not in the explosive way I imagined I'd be if I ever discovered the truth. Mostly I felt grief. Grief for all the ordinary life moments nobody could return now. Missed birthdays. Graduations. My mother's funeral anniversary. The birth of my grandson Ethan. 20 years of small human moments stolen quietly, one piece at a time. My father looked shattered. Why would you do this? He whispered. Diane pressed trembling fingers against her forehead. You always made her the center of everything after Ellen died. My mother. Even hearing her name after all these years hurt. You talked about Claire constantly. You compared every holiday to how Ellen used to do things. Diane's voice cracked slightly. I spent years trying to build a life with you while feeling like a replacement nobody actually wanted. My father stared at her in disbelief. So you erased my daughter? No, she snapped immediately. Then softer. I just needed peace. That sentence stayed with me. Because terrible things inside families often begin with people convincing themselves they're protecting stability. Not cruelty? Fear. Fear dressed up as practicality. A nurse entered briefly to check medications, instantly sensing the tension. After she left, my father looked toward me again. Claire. His eyes filled suddenly. I thought you hated me. I swallowed hard. I thought you forgot me. That nearly destroyed him. At 79 years old, weakened by a stroke, my father started crying like a lost child in that hospital bed. Not dramatic sobbing. Quiet grief? The kind older men from his generation rarely allow themselves to show. "I waited every Christmas," he whispered, "even after Diane said you moved on." I closed my eyes briefly. I waited too. The room went completely still after that. Diane sat back down slowly in the corner chair, looking smaller somehow. Less powerful. Just human. Broken human beings look surprisingly ordinary once their control disappears. Later that afternoon, while my father slept, I stepped into the hallway to call my son Michael. He answered immediately. "How's Grandpa?" I leaned against the hospital wall heavily. "It's worse than we thought." I explained everything quietly. The letters. The lies. The years wasted. Michael stayed silent for several seconds after I finished. Then he asked the question I'd secretly been avoiding myself. "Mom, are you going to forgive him?" I looked through the hospital window toward downtown Cleveland, blurred beneath falling snow. "I don't know yet," I answered honestly. Because forgiveness gets complicated once enough life has passed. It's easier when people are younger. Before funerals. Before lost decades. Before parents become frail enough to remind you time is almost gone. That evening before leaving, I sat beside my father while he slept. The monitors glowed softly in the darkened room. His face looked older than I remembered. Smaller somehow. I realized then that all my anger over the years had preserved him in memory as stronger than he really was. But now, he looked like an old man who spent 20 years mourning a daughter still alive. And somewhere deep down, I think I started mourning him too. 3 days later, I drove to my childhood home in western Pennsylvania for the first time in almost 19 years. The old Whitaker house sat near a narrow lake outside Meadville, where winters always smelled faintly of wood smoke and frozen water. My parents bought the place in 1974, when steel mill layoffs were sweeping through parts of western Pennsylvania, and modest homes could still be purchased on one income if people worked hard enough. To me, that house had once felt permanent. Childhood homes usually do, until life teaches you otherwise. I almost turned around twice during the drive. Partly because of the weather. Mostly because I wasn't sure I wanted to see what time had done to the place. The roads near the lake looked smaller than I remembered. So did the neighborhood. That happens after 60. You revisit places that once held your entire universe and realize they were ordinary all along. The house itself still stood near the end of the cul-de-sac beneath 2 giant maple trees my father planted the year I started middle school. But something about it felt wrong immediately. The porch swing was gone. My mother's flower beds had disappeared beneath decorative gravel. Even the shutters had been painted a colder color. I sat in my car for nearly 5 minutes before getting out. The air smelled like snow coming. A man across the street clearing leaves from his driveway glanced up at me twice before finally recognizing me. "Claire." I turned. It took me a second to place him. "Mr. Donnelly." He laughed softly. Well, damn, nobody's called me Mr. in years. Frank Donnelly had lived across from us since I was 14. Older now. Bent slightly at the shoulders. But still carrying the same gravelly voice I remembered from summer cookouts and fishing trips with my father. He walked over slowly holding a rake. "Heard Harold had a stroke." "Yeah. How's he doing?" I looked back toward the house. "I honestly don't know." Frank nodded carefully, like somebody who understood that answer meant more than medical condition. Then his eyes narrowed slightly. "You haven't been here in a long time." "No." He hesitated. "Thought maybe you didn't want anything to do with the place anymore." There it was again. The story Diane apparently told everyone. I forced a small smile. Turns out there were misunderstandings. Frank studied my face quietly. Then something shifted in his expression. "Jesus Christ," he muttered softly. "Older people know things without needing long explanations sometimes." He leaned closer. "Your father used to sit on that porch waiting for your car every Christmas Eve." That sentence hit harder than almost anything yet. I stared at him. "What?" Frank nodded slowly. "For years." I suddenly couldn't breathe correctly. "He told everyone you were busy raising your boy," Frank continued gently. But honestly, he looked down at the rake in his hands. He always looked heartbroken. I swallowed hard. Because while I spent 20 years believing my father stopped caring, apparently the entire neighborhood watched him grieve me openly. Frank eventually patted my shoulder awkwardly before returning home. I stood alone in the driveway staring at the house for another minute before finally walking toward the front door. Diane answered after the second knock. She looked irritated seeing me there, then nervous. "You should have called first." "I wanted to see the house." Her jaw tightened slightly, but she stepped aside. The inside smelled different immediately. "Not bad. Just unfamiliar." My mother's house had once smelled like cinnamon candles, coffee, and laundry soap. Now everything carried expensive artificial lavender from automatic wall dispensers. Too clean. Too staged. Like a furniture showroom trying to imitate comfort. I walked slowly through the living room. The piano was gone. My mother's quilt chest, too. Even the old family photographs had disappeared from the hallway walls. "Where's Mom's stuff?" I asked quietly. Diane folded her arms. "We downsized years ago. This house has 4 bedrooms. You know what I mean?" "No." Actually, I didn't. I walked toward the den. My father's recliner remained near the television, but almost everything else had changed. Then I noticed the empty corner beside the fireplace. My stomach tightened instantly. "Where's the cedar cabinet?" Diane looked away briefly. "We sold it." That cabinet had belonged to my grandfather. Handmade. 3 generations old. "You sold it." "We needed space." "For what?" Her face hardened. "You don't live here, Claire." That sentence cut deeper than she probably intended. Because technically she was right. I moved slowly down the hallway toward what used to be my mother's sewing room. Only now it was some kind of exercise space with yoga mats and storage shelves. I stood there staring silently. My mother spent 15 years in that room making curtains, Halloween costumes, prom dresses, and baby blankets for church families who couldn't afford them. Now it smelled like rubber flooring and scented candles. "When did all this happen?" I whispered. "Over time." I turned toward her sharply. "You sold her things without telling me." Diane's patience finally cracked. "You weren't around." The words echoed down the hallway. We both froze afterward. Then quieter. "I couldn't keep living in a mausoleum dedicated to your mother." That complicated things emotionally because part of me understood exactly what she meant. Nobody deserves to spend decades feeling compared to a dead spouse. Still, she was my mother too, I said softly. Diane's face shifted slightly after hearing that. Not softer exactly, but less defensive. "I saved some things," she muttered. "Like what?" She disappeared into the bedroom briefly before returning with a small cardboard box. Inside sat old photographs, my mother's wedding ring, several handwritten recipes, and underneath them all, my childhood Christmas stocking. I stared at it silently. The stitched reindeer still missing one button eye after our dog chewed it off in 1978. I suddenly started crying before I could stop myself. Not loud. Just exhausted grief finally overflowing somewhere safe enough to land. 20 years. 20 years gone because insecure adults built separate realities around one grieving family. Diane stood awkwardly near the hallway watching me. Then quietly, almost defensively, she whispered, "I never thought it would go this far." That was the first truly honest thing she'd said since I arrived. By the second week of my father's recovery, the hospital staff had started recognizing me on site. The overnight nurses nodded when I arrived. The cafeteria cashier knew I preferred black coffee. Even the parking attendant near the garage entrance stopped charging me full price after learning I'd been driving back and forth from Pittsburgh almost daily. Hospitals become strange little temporary worlds once someone you love starts lingering between recovery and decline. Time moves differently inside them. My father had improved enough to speak more clearly by then, though the stroke still left him physically weak. Some mornings he sounded almost like himself again. Other mornings confusion drifted back in around the edges. But one thing remained constant. Every time I walked into the room he looked relieved. That alone healed something inside me I didn't realize was still broken. One rainy Thursday afternoon I found him awake and staring out the window toward downtown Cleveland wrapped in gray fog. "You look serious," I said gently while setting my purse down. He smiled faintly. "I was remembering your mother yelling at me for buying a fishing boat we couldn't afford." I laughed despite myself. She was right. Usually was. I pulled my chair closer beside the bed. For a while we simply sat quietly listening to rain tap against the glass. Older people don't always need constant conversation the way younger ones do. Sometimes companionship itself becomes enough. Then suddenly my father spoke again. "Claire." "Yeah." His voice grew fragile. "Did you really think I stopped loving you?" That question broke something open inside me so fast it physically hurt. I looked down at my hands immediately because eye contact suddenly felt impossible. For years I'd imagined this conversation differently. Angrier. Sharper. But sitting beside a frail old man in a hospital bed changes revenge into something sadder. I didn't know what to think anymore, I admitted quietly. He kept watching me carefully. I wrote letters, called, sent cards. His voice trembled slightly, and eventually nothing came back except silence. I swallowed hard. I called too. His eyes widened. After Mom died, I kept calling the house. I continued. At first Diane said you were sleeping, or tired, or busy. I paused, then eventually she started saying you didn't want to talk. He looked stunned. She told me you said I blamed you for remarrying. My chest tightened immediately. What? She said seeing me moved on hurt you. I almost laughed from disbelief. Moved on. My mother died at 58 years old after 2 years of chemotherapy. Nobody in that family moved on. We survived. That's different. I spent birthdays waiting for phone calls, I whispered. Christmases, too. My father covered his eyes briefly with one trembling hand. Oh, God. I thought you chose your new family over me. His breathing became uneven again. The heart monitor quickened softly. I never stopped loving you, he whispered brokenly, not one day. And that was the sentence I'd secretly needed for 20 years. Not money. Not inheritance. Not revenge. Just that. I suddenly started crying harder than I had since my mother's funeral. Not dramatic sobbing. The quiet, exhausted crying older people do when grief finally gets tired of staying organized. My father reached weakly for my hand. I missed everything, he whispered. I nodded through tears. You missed Michael growing up. I know. His graduation. Tears rolled sideways into his hairline against the pillow. I know. The divorce. His eyes widened slightly. You got divorced. I laughed bitterly through tears. 8 years ago. My God. That reaction alone told me how completely disconnected he'd been from my real life. You have a great-grandson, I continued softly. His name's Ethan. My father stared at me. Then suddenly smiled through tears. Ethan. He's 7. I have a great-grandson. The heartbreak in his voice nearly destroyed me. Because no amount of apology could return those lost years now. Nobody in that room was getting time back. Not him. Not me. Not Michael. Eventually, he fell asleep from emotional exhaustion. I remained beside the bed, quietly holding his hand long after his breathing steadied again. About an hour later, I stepped into the hallway and nearly collided with Diane carrying vending machine coffee. She looked exhausted, too. Not polished anymore. Not superior. Just worn down by consequences finally arriving. He asleep, she asked quietly. Yes. She nodded slowly. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, unexpectedly, she said, I never planned this. I folded my arms carefully. Then what did you plan? Diane stared into the coffee cup for several seconds before answering. When Harold married me, I was 47 and terrified. That honesty surprised me. My first husband left me for a younger woman, she continued quietly. Then Harold came along grieving and lonely and still talking about Ellen constantly. My mother again. Always my mother standing invisibly between them. At first I only wanted space to build a marriage, Diane admitted. But every time you called, her voice cracked slightly. He lit up differently. I stared at her. And that threatened you? Yes. At least she told the truth now. He loved you in a way I could never compete with, she whispered. That's because I was his daughter. I know that now. Silence settled between us. Then Diane finally looked up at me fully. I started small, she admitted, delaying messages, saying you were busy, saying he should give you space. Tears gathered in her eyes. And after enough years passed, I didn't know how to undo it. That was the horrifying part. Families rarely explode overnight. They drift apart through thousands of smaller selfish decisions nobody stops quickly enough. I stole 20 years from him, Diane whispered. I looked back toward the hospital room where my father slept beneath pale fluorescent light. No, I answered quietly, you stole them from all of us. 3 days after Diane admitted what she had done, my father asked for his lawyer. Not eventually. Not after thinking it over. That morning, I was sitting beside his bed peeling the foil lid off a cup of hospital applesauce when he turned his head toward me and said, Claire, I need Martin Hale. I knew that name. Martin had handled my parents' wills decades earlier, back when my mother still kept every important document in a blue accordion folder under the hall closet. Are you sure you're up for that? I asked. My father looked smaller beneath the hospital blanket, but his eyes had regained something steady. I've avoided enough. That sentence told me not to argue. By noon, Martin Hale arrived with a leather briefcase, silver hair, and the careful expression of a man who had spent 40 years walking into family storms wearing a suit. He recognized me immediately. Claire Bennett, he said softly. It's been a long time. Yes, it has. He didn't ask why. Good lawyers and old family friends know when questions are too heavy for hallways. My father requested a full family meeting for the following afternoon. Diane was to be there. So were her 2 adult children, Brad and Melissa. My son Michael drove in from Columbus with Ethan's crayon drawing folded in his jacket pocket because he didn't know what else to bring to a grandfather he barely knew. Nobody wanted that meeting. But sometimes families require witnesses before truth can stop being negotiable. The next day, the hospital arranged for us to use a small consultation room near the cardiac wing. It had beige walls, a long table, bad coffee, and a box of tissues placed in the center like the staff already knew tears were scheduled. My father arrived in a wheelchair pushed by a nurse. He looked tired but determined. Diane walked beside him, pale and silent. Her daughter Melissa hugged her first, then looked toward me with confusion and caution. Brad, a broad-shouldered insurance agent from Lakewood, stood near the window with his arms folded like he expected a fight. Michael sat beside me. He put his hand over mine under the table. That small gesture steadied me more than he'll ever know. Martin opened his briefcase but didn't begin speaking. He looked at my father. Harold, this is your meeting. My father nodded. His voice was weaker now, but every word carried. For 20 years, he began, I believed my daughter chose to leave my life. Nobody moved. Brad glanced at Diane. Melissa's face tightened. My father continued, I wrote letters. I sent cards. I asked about her. I asked to call her. And I was told she didn't want me anymore. Diane closed her eyes. Melissa whispered, Mom. Diane didn't answer. My father turned slightly toward her. Diane has admitted she interfered with those letters and calls. The room changed instantly. Brad stood straighter. What does that mean, interfered? Martin spoke carefully. It means correspondence was withheld, misrepresented, or prevented from reaching the intended person. Brad looked stunned. Melissa's hand went to her mouth. I watched Diane shrink under the weight of her own children's eyes. There is a particular kind of shame that arrives only when your children see the whole truth of you. Diane began crying quietly. I thought I was protecting him, she said. Brad stared at her. From his daughter. Diane flinched. My father raised one weak hand. No yelling. Brad looked away, jaw tight. My father turned toward me then. I also let it happen. I opened my mouth, but he stopped me. No, Claire, I was your father. I should have come looking myself. I should have driven to Pittsburgh, knocked on your door, asked you face to face. His voice broke slightly. I let hurt pride and bad health make me passive. That honesty hurt worse than blame. Because blame gives you something to push against. Truth simply sits there. Michael leaned forward. Grandpa, he said carefully, using that word for the first time in my hearing, my mom spent most of my life thinking you didn't care. My father looked at him with devastated eyes. I know. Then Michael reached into his jacket and unfolded Ethan's drawing. A crooked house. A yellow sun. 4 stick figures holding hands. Your great-grandson made this, Michael said. He doesn't understand everything, but he knows he has family he hasn't met yet. My father took the paper with trembling fingers. He looked at it for a long time. Then he pressed it against his chest. That was the moment no inheritance could compete with. Martin cleared his throat gently. Harold also asked me to bring updated estate documents. Diane looked up sharply. There it was. The part everyone had been pretending not to think about. Money changes the temperature of family rooms faster than almost anything. My father noticed. This is not punishment, he said firmly. He looked at Diane first. You will be cared for. I won't leave you unsafe. Diane began crying harder. But I am restoring what should have never been taken from Claire. Martin explained the changes simply. Sentimental property from my mother's side would come to me. The lake cabin in Pennsylvania would be placed in a family trust for my line with access allowed for any family member who came respectfully. Certain savings would be divided fairly, including Diane's children, because my father said they didn't cause this. Brad looked down when he heard that. Melissa started crying. Then my father asked Diane to give me the small velvet box. For a moment she didn't move. Then slowly, with shaking hands, she reached into her purse and placed the box on the table. I knew before opening it. My mother's wedding ring. The one Diane told me years earlier had been misplaced during cleaning. I opened the lid. The diamond was tiny by modern standards. Almost modest. But my father had worked overtime for months to buy it in 1968. I couldn't speak. My father whispered, "Your mother wanted you to have it." I held the ring in my palm and felt 20 years of anger shift into something much heavier. Grief. Diane looked at me through tears. "I'm sorry," she said. Not defensive this time. Not polished. Just broken. I wanted to say I forgave her. I wanted to be the kind of woman who could offer grace immediately and make the whole room feel better. But forgiveness that comes too quickly is sometimes just another form of pretending. So I told the truth. I hear you. Diane nodded like she understood that was all she deserved for now. My father reached toward me. I took his hand. Then he looked around the room at all of us, wife, daughter, stepchildren, grandson, and said quietly, "Don't let silence become a family tradition." Nobody answered. Because everyone in that room knew he was right. My father lived 4 months after that family meeting. Not long enough to make up for 20 years. But long enough to make those months matter. That is something age teaches you if life gives you enough years to understand it. Sometimes healing doesn't arrive in dramatic amounts. Sometimes it comes in small daily portions like medicine measured carefully in a plastic hospital cup. After 2 more weeks at Presbyterian Memorial, Dad moved to a rehabilitation center outside Cleveland. It was the kind of place you pass on the road and never think much about until someone you love is inside. Brick building. Automatic doors. A lobby that smelled faintly of disinfectant coffee and overcooked vegetables. His room looked out over a small courtyard where sparrows picked at crumbs beneath a wooden bench. I drove there twice a week from Pittsburgh. Michael came whenever work allowed. And one Saturday afternoon he brought Ethan. My father had been nervous all morning. I could tell by the way he kept smoothing the blanket over his knees. "He's only 7, I told him gently. "He's not coming to inspect you." Dad gave me a weak smile. "I don't know how to be a great-grandfather." "You start by being kind." When Ethan walked in carrying a plastic dinosaur and wearing light-up sneakers, my father's whole face changed. Not younger exactly, but brighter. Ethan studied him carefully for about 3 seconds, then held up the dinosaur. "This is a stegosaurus. He's not mean unless people bother him." My father nodded solemnly. "I understand that completely." And just like that, 4 generations met in a room that should have held birthday parties and Thanksgiving visits years earlier. I won't pretend it was easy. Some visits were tender. Others were awkward. Dad would ask questions he should have known the answers to. When did Michael get divorced? What was your job before the school cafeteria? Did you keep singing in church? Each question reminded me of another empty place in our family timeline. But he asked. And I answered. That mattered. Diane came often too. At first I avoided being alone with her. Not cruelly. Carefully. There is a difference. She had apologized and I believed part of her was sincere. But sincerity does not erase damage simply because people are tired of carrying guilt. One afternoon in the rehabilitation center cafeteria, she sat across from me with a paper cup of weak coffee and said, "I've started writing everything down." I looked at her. "What do you mean?" "The truth," she said quietly. "For Brad and Melissa. For your son too, if he ever wants it. I don't want anybody else guessing after I'm gone." That was the first time I saw her do something restorative without being forced. No courtroom. No audience. No control. Just accountability. "I think that's good," I said. She nodded. "I was lonely when I married Harold." I didn't respond. She continued anyway. "But loneliness doesn't excuse stealing other people from each other." That sentence stayed with me. Because she finally understood the plainness of it. Not family conflict. Not complicated emotions. Theft. She had stolen time. And time is the one thing no inheritance can return. Dad came home briefly before the end under hospice care to the house near Meadville. I stayed there with him for 10 days. The house felt strange but less hostile after Diane began taking down some of the staged decorations and letting the old photographs return to the hallway. My mother's picture went back near the staircase. Not as a threat, as history. One evening, snow fell softly over the lake while Dad and I sat near the living room window. His breathing had become thinner by then. The hospice nurse said hearing often remains even when people grow weak, so I talked more than usual. I told him about Michael's teenage years, about Ethan's first day of school, about the summer my car broke down and 3 cafeteria ladies helped me push it into a church parking lot while laughing so hard we forgot to be embarrassed. He listened with his eyes closed. At one point he whispered, "I missed a good life." I took his hand. "You missed parts of it," I said, "but you're here now." He opened his eyes and looked at me. "I'm sorry, Claire Bear. That old nickname nearly undid me." "I know, Dad. I should have come looking." "Yes," I whispered, "you should have." He nodded faintly. No argument. No excuse. That was the closest thing to peace we were going to get. He passed 3 nights later just before dawn, while the lake outside was still dark and quiet. I was holding his hand. Diane stood on the other side of the bed. For a moment after his breathing stopped, neither of us moved. Then Diane whispered, "He loved you." This time I believed her. The funeral was held at the little Presbyterian church my parents attended when I was a child. Frank Donnelly came. So did old neighbors, former co-workers, Diane's children, Michael and Ethan, who wore a clip-on tie and behaved with great seriousness. After the service, Diane handed me a small box of recovered photographs. Some were of me as a girl, some of my mother, some of my father sitting on the porch in later years looking toward the driveway. I didn't ask who took that one. I already knew. Months later, I reopened the lake cabin. The roof needed work. The porch sagged. The plumbing complained like an old man getting out of a chair. But when Michael, Ethan, and I walked inside, sunlight fell across the dusty floor just the way I remembered from childhood summers. Ethan ran straight to the window. "Can we come here every year?" I looked at Michael. He smiled. I said, "Yes, I think we can." That is what reconciliation looked like for us. Not forgetting. Not pretending. Building something honest from what remained. I still think about those lost 20 years. Of course I do. But I no longer let them be the only part of the story. My father and I were lied to. We were separated. We were robbed of ordinary days. But in the end, truth found its way into a hospital room through one simple question. "Why didn't you ever answer my letters?" And that question gave us back just enough time to say what silence had stolen. So, if there is someone you love and distance has grown between you, don't let pride do the work of time. Ask, call, write, knock on the door if you have to. Because sometimes families aren't broken by hate. They're broken by silence. And silence should never become a family tradition. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who may need the courage to reach out before it's too late. And if you believe stories like this still matter, please comment where you're watching from, and subscribe for more emotional family stories about truth, dignity, forgiveness, and second chances.